The wind blew so hard it felt like a punishment from a forgotten god, flinging needles of snow across the railroad platform, curling between the boards, pushing through seams in coats, boots, and bones. The sky hung low and colorless, like a woolen shroud smothering the world. No trains came. Only the cold. She stood alone beneath the warped awning of the old station, clutching her arms around herself, trying to keep her ribs from rattling. Eileen Whitlow, 27, with hair half frozen and lips cracked raw, looked like a ghost no one had bothered to bury. Her boots were soaked through. One was split at the toe. She'd wrapped a petticoat around her shoulders, but the fabric clung to her like a wet rag. Her eyes weren't desperate. Not yet. Just empty, as if whatever had driven her this far had already burned away everything else. A man passed by. An old miner in a greasy coat glanced at her, looked away. A mother pulled her child close and crossed to the far side of the depot. No one spoke. They all saw her. They just pretended not to. She had nothing but a satchel and a folded letter she hadn't opened in weeks. Somewhere behind her ribs, a piece of her still believed someone might come for her. Someone who hadn't already chosen someone else. But belief shrinks fast in weather like this. A snowball hit the post beside her head. A group of boys laughed from across the tracks, their cheeks red with wind and mischief. "Beggar girl," one of them shouted. "Hey! You marry that Apache yet?" The laughter carried, sharp as sleet. Eileen flinched, but she didn't run. She didn't even move. Then the laughter stopped. Not because she'd glared them down. Something else had silenced it. Boot steps. Heavy, deliberate. Pressing into snow with the weight of a man who walked like the earth owed him nothing. He was taller than any man had a right to be, and broad across the shoulders, wrapped in a long buffalo hide coat lined with mountain wool. His skin was deep copper, his eyes darker still. Hair tied in a long braid down his back, dusted white with falling snow. An Apache, though no one dared say it to his face. He didn't look at the boys. Didn't look at the townsfolk watching from inside the mercantile window. He looked only at her. Eileen blinked as he approached. She didn't know what to expect. A warning? A question? But he said nothing. She straightened, trying to keep some dignity, even as her teeth chattered. "I'm fine," she whispered, too quietly to matter. He stepped beside her, reached up, and without asking, removed the coat from his shoulders. It smelled of smoke, pine, and something she hadn't known she missed: warmth. He placed it around her with the kind of care you'd give to laying earth over a grave. Her first instinct was to pull away. No man had touched her with kindness in years. But the heat hit her so suddenly, so deeply, she swayed beneath it. She looked up at him, stunned. "Why?" He didn't answer. Just gave a nod, barely more than a tilt of the chin, and walked past her, snow crunching beneath his boots. The storm swallowed him within seconds. The boys were gone now. So was the noise. She sat down on the bench, trembling, not from cold anymore, but from something else. The coat hung heavy around her shoulders. She gathered it tighter, holding it like it might disappear. Her fingers found a tear in the seam. Mended by hand. Someone had cared enough to fix it. She didn't know his name. Only that she'd seen him once, months ago, passing through town with lumber tied to his horse. Folks whispered about him. Said he lived out in the pines, near Deadman's Hollow. Said he'd buried his wife and child beneath a cedar tree and hadn't spoken more than a dozen words since. They called him Bearstride. Not to his face. No one spoke to his face. The coat smelled like cedar smoke, like long rides in winter, like something old and strong. She pressed her face into the collar and let her eyes close for the first time in 2 days. Later, Martha Hollis would find her there, curled like a child beneath a stranger's coat. Martha would mutter, but she'd lead her into the boarding house anyway, muttering still. "Damn fool Apache, giving you that," Martha said as she lit the fire. "Town don't take kindly to his sort. Or yours, come to think of it." Eileen didn't answer. She stared at the flames, remembering how he hadn't spoken, hadn't asked, hadn't waited. Just gave. Some nights later, she would lie awake in the cot at the back of the laundry room, turning the coat sleeve in her hands, running her fingers over the mended seam. She didn't know what it meant. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. All she knew was that something had shifted. The cold had found a rival. Word spread, as it always did in towns with more windows than hearts. The widow girl, they said, was wearing an Apache's coat. She'd arrived dirty, barefoot, like a story no one wanted to finish. And now, there was talk, soft but sharp. Questions without answers. Who was she? What did she do to earn that? And worst of all, was she staying? Eileen began sweeping floors, mending bedsheets, scrubbing mud off boots left by louder guests. She took it all. Took the gossip, the stares, the way even children looked at her like she'd done something shameful just by surviving. She'd known shame. This wasn't it. Outside the boarding house, the snow kept falling. Thick and soft. As if the world had decided to bury its sins in silence. She wore the coat everywhere. Not because it was warm, though it was. But because it was the first thing in a long time that made her feel like she hadn't vanished. The boy who'd thrown the snowball came by once. Stood across the street, shuffling his feet. Said nothing. Then walked off. She watched him go, lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't wave. Weeks passed. The storm came and went. So did the trains. But she stayed. No longer waiting for someone. Just, not leaving. Every morning, she folded the coat carefully, set it beside her, then picked it up again before she stepped outside. As if it might stop breathing if she let it go too long. She didn't know if he'd come back. Or if he even remembered what he'd done. But deep in the lining of that coat, stitched in the memory of snow and breath and silence, something had begun to thaw. And though she didn't know it yet, neither of them would ever be the same. Not after that moment beneath the awning. Not after a kindness that asked for nothing. Not after the storm. And not after the warmth. Eileen stepped into town with the coat still wrapped around her like armor, the hem brushing her knees, the shoulders too broad for her frame. Snow had crusted into dirt on the edges, but she wore it anyway. It wasn't just the warmth, it was what it meant. What it reminded her of. A man who hadn't spoken, hadn't judged, hadn't asked her to explain why she was shivering alone at a station platform like a forgotten note. The streets were slush now, browning and soft underfoot. Ice clung to porch rails and shutter hinges, and the windows along Main Street seemed to blink slowly in the morning fog. Townsfolk had returned to their patterns, moving from shop to chapel, saloon to stable, but when Eileen passed, their steps stuttered. Their eyes followed her, like dogs sniffing something unfamiliar. She kept her gaze low and her steps careful. Her cheeks still burned, not from cold this time, but from that other sting. The one that comes from being seen but not welcomed. Inside the boarding house, Martha Hollis scowled the way someone scowls at a rain cloud that won't leave. "Keep your head down," she muttered, handing Eileen a rag and pointing toward the boot tracks on the floorboards. "You got a place to sleep. Don't ruin it with foolishness." Eileen nodded. That was all she did these days, nod, listen, scrub. Her hands ached from the lye soap, but the ache was honest. Not like the bruises she used to hide beneath sleeves and smiles. The first man who dared speak to her wasn't kind. He leaned in through the kitchen's back door with a grin soured by chewing tobacco and said, "That coat don't belong to you, girl. You earn it? Or just took what he gave?" His laughter lingered even after he left. Eileen said nothing. But she folded the coat over the back of her chair that night like it was holy. That patch she'd stitched in secret right over the heart, she ran her fingers across it as she lay down, listening to wind against the windows. She didn't know his name. Still. But his silence had said more than anyone else's words ever had. She started asking quietly, at the mercantile, the smithy, the feed store. Not much. Just a simple, careful question, the man with the long braid. The one who gave me the coat. Does he live nearby? Most folks gave her a shrug or a look that warned her not to ask again. Only the old blacksmith, Arlen Mott, answered with anything more than a grunt. "Bearstride," he said, hammer paused mid-swing. "Lives out near Deadman's Hollow. Old homestead what used to belong to the Cochrane family for the fever took M. He ain't friendly. Ain't mean neither. Just quiet. Lost a wife and boy long time back. Don't expect he's lookin' to find anything else." Eileen thanked him and left before she was noticed. It was 2 days later when she saw him again. She had just finished washing a row of tavern linens when she stepped outside into the thin morning frost. And there he was, across the way, near the watering trough. His horse stood still. So did he. Watching. She froze, unsure. Part of her wanted to run. Part of her wanted to cross the street without thinking. Instead, she just gave a small nod, shy but honest. He returned it. Just once. Then mounted up and rode on. That night, Martha poured a thin stew and set it down harder than necessary. "Heard you been talkin' about him," she said. "You'd do well to stop. Folks are already askin' questions about you." Eileen looked up. "What kind of questions?" "What kind that don't lead to a second chance," Martha snapped. "You got a roof here because I'm kind, not because I'm blind. A woman comes into town with nothing but a man's coat and no husband to claim her? That's trouble. Apache or not." Eileen stared at her bowl. Swallowed the lump in her throat. "He's the only one who's been kind to me," she whispered. Martha softened, but not much. Kindness don't last long when folks start looking. And they're lookin', girl. 2 days later, she was sweeping behind the saloon when she heard the laughter again. 3 men stood at the edge of the alley, leaning against barrels, smoke curling from their cigars. They weren't drunk, but they wanted to be. The kind of men who fed off mean talk. "Look at that," one said. "Little runaway settler wearin' a redskin's coat. Ain't that somethin'? I reckon she's warm in his bed, too," another chuckled. "Or maybe he just took pity on her poor white soul." Eileen froze, the broom tight in her hand. "Think he speaks English?" one asked. "Or just grunts when he—" The sentence never finished. A shadow moved behind them. Quietly. Deliberately. The tallest man stepped back, then turned. The air seemed to crackle. Bearstride stood there, eyes unreadable, arms crossed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Enough," he said. That single word hit like a thunderclap. The men quieted, backs stiffening. One spat. "Just havin' a bit of fun." Bearstride stepped forward. Not fast, not threatening. But steady. Like the tide. They left. Eileen didn't realize she was shaking until he turned to her. His eyes softened. Just slightly. "Thank you," she said, barely audible. He nodded. Then walked away. She stared after him until he vanished between the buildings. Later that night, she took out a needle and thread. Pulled the coat over her knees. And stitched a new patch, this one near the pocket. It wasn't torn. She just wanted to leave something of herself there. She didn't sleep that night. Just watched the shadows play across the walls and listened to the boarding house breathe around her. The next day, she asked Martha for half a day off. Said she wanted to return something. And though Martha scowled, she allowed it. Eileen walked past the bakery, past the chapel, past the last house on the ridge. The town fell behind her, its voices fading like wine down a well. Ahead, the pines thickened. The snow brightened. The world quieted. She wasn't sure what she'd say when she saw him again. If she saw him again. But the coat was clean, mended, folded over her arm like a gift no one had asked for. She walked on. And somewhere beyond the edge of the known, past judgment, past whispers, past what had been done to her and what had been taken, something waited. Silent. Watching. Warm. The path curved like a question through the snow-heavy pines, the trees standing in tall, silent judgment as Eileen trudged forward, her her breath ghosting out in short bursts. She hadn't told anyone where she was going. Wouldn't have mattered if she had. Folks in town already thought she belonged to no place but rumor. She clutched the coat tightly against her chest. It was warm again, not from the fire, but from being held so close. The patch she'd sewn by the pocket felt like a secret handshake only he would understand. Still, she wondered if returning it would be taken wrong. Or worse, if he wouldn't remember her at all. The cabin appeared suddenly through the trees, like something the snow had been hiding until now. It wasn't large, but it stood with a kind of quiet dignity. The roof sagged slightly under the season's weight. Smoke rose thin and straight from the chimney, curling into the pale sky. A hound lifted its head from the porch and stared at her with pale, unreadable eyes. Eileen stopped several paces away. The forest was too quiet. Her boots had left no crunch for a while now, just soft prints that would vanish by dusk. She took a breath and stepped forward, slow enough not to startle anything, though her heart thundered loud enough to wake the birds. The front door creaked open before she could raise a hand. Bearstride stood there, backlit by the dim glow of the fire inside. His face was unreadable, same as the first time, but something behind his eyes flickered. Recognition, maybe. Or patience. I came to return this, she said, lifting the coat, her voice barely more than a whisper. You shouldn't be gone without it. I patched the seam. She held it out with both hands. It felt strange to let it go. He stepped forward but didn't take it. Instead, he looked at her hands, red from cold, then back to her eyes. You walk from town? He asked, voice low and firm, not unkind. She nodded. You eat yet? She blinked. No. He stepped aside. Just enough for her to see the fire. The room behind him was spare, one table, one bed, shelves built into the wall, jars and skins and old tools. A rifle resting high out of reach. Everything in its place. The hound followed her in, tail swaying once before it lay down near the hearth. She stood awkwardly in the center of the room, coat still in her arms. He motioned toward a chair carved from pine, the seat worn smooth from long use. She sat. Bearstride moved to the pot near the fire and ladled something thick and steaming into a tin bowl. Venison stew. She recognized the scent: smoke, pepper, onion. When he placed it in her hands, she whispered thanks without lifting her eyes. The first spoonful burned her tongue slightly, but she didn't stop. She hadn't eaten hot food in days. He sat across from her, resting an elbow on the table, watching the flames more than her. You stitched the seam, he said. She nodded. Didn't feel right, wearing it without fixing what was torn. Silence stretched again. Not uneasy, just natural, like the space between tree trunks. My name's Eileen, she offered. He nodded once. Bearstride. She nodded back, though she'd already known. I wasn't sure you'd remember me. I do. Something about the way he said it made her throat go tight. She looked down at the stew and took another bite to fill the quiet. After a while, he asked, Why'd you come west? Eileen looked toward the window, where frost bloomed in the corners of the glass. Wasn't a place left for me back east. Married too young. He drank too much. He didn't like silence, so he'd beat it out of me. He said nothing. I ran. Been running a long time. She paused. I thought the wind might carry me somewhere gentler. But it hasn't yet. His voice was soft this time. It might still. They fell quiet again. The kind of quiet that comes from sharing something that can't be taken back. She finished her stew slowly, aware of how the warmth settled into her bones like an apology. Your home is peaceful, she said. It's honest. That word sat between them a long time. Honest. Her eyes wandered. A shelf of wooden carvings, small animals, feathers, a bowl of turquoise beads. On the far wall, 2 framed sketches, a woman with laughing eyes, a boy no older than 6. The firelight made their faces shimmer like spirits caught in the moment before waking. She didn't ask. But he answered anyway. Wife and son.
Fever winter of 73. Buried them out back. Under the cedar.
I'm sorry, she said, quietly. He looked down at his hands.
So am I.
For a moment, she imagined reaching across the table, placing her palm over his.
But she didn't.
She didn't know if either of them was ready for that yet. Outside, the snow had slowed to a gentle fall, drifting like feathers through the pine boughs. I should go, she said at last, standing.
Towel talk if I stay longer. He stood too but didn't move to stop her.
I'll walk you part way, he said.
She hesitated, then smiled. I'd like that.
She wrapped the coat around herself once more.
He didn't ask for it back. They walked in silence beneath the trees, boots sinking into soft snow.
The only sound was wind brushing through branches and the occasional creak of a tree limb heavy with winter. He stopped near the ridge that marked the edge of townland.
They watch you too close. She turned to face him. They watched you first.
He gave the smallest nod.
She looked down. I don't know what this is. Or what I'm doing.
You're surviving, he said. Her eyes met his.
And you?
He hesitated.
Then, waiting.
She wanted to ask, for what?
For whom?
But the question dissolved on her lips. Instead, she said, thank you.
For the stew. For everything.
He didn't speak, but the look in his eyes said more than enough. She took a step back, then another. The coat still wrapped around her, stitched in places with her own thread, holding stories neither of them had told yet. I'll return the coat soon, she said.
You already have.
The cold wind came up behind her as she turned, but it couldn't touch the place the warmth had reached. And as she walked back into town, she knew this wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. The first warning came not with thunder or snow, but with whispers. Eileen heard them while hanging laundry behind the boarding house, two women near the well, voices hushed but sharp-edged.
She's living up there now, you know. With him. An Apache and a runaway widow. Imagine the shame.
She wears his coat like a brand.
The lines tightened in Eileen's face, though her hands kept moving.
The wind flapped the linen like flags of surrender.
She didn't cry. Not anymore.
She simply folded the damp shirt over the line, pinned it, and walked back inside, her footsteps steady though her heart thudded like distant hooves.
Martha stopped her in the hallway. What are you stirring up out there, girl?
I'm not stirring anything, Eileen said quietly.
You're bringing a storm.
Eileen met her gaze. The storm was here long before me. The door slammed harder than it needed to. By week's end, the whispers had thickened into voices, and the voices into fists on tables. The sheriff, Jed Price, with his heavy jaw and heavier pride, stepped out of the saloon one afternoon, flanked by two men with stiff hats and loose tongues.
They weren't drunk. They were something worse, sober and angry.
She's stayin' out at his cabin now, they say.
Town's got laws. Ways. She don't follow 'em, she don't belong here. He's got weapons. Land. Could be planning something.
Who knows what kind of Apache magic's goin' on out there? Sheriff Price raised a hand, but not to quiet them, just to claim their noise.
We'll ride up. Just a check.
Keep peace before trouble starts.
It was not an offer.
That night, Eileen packed what little she had into the same satchel she'd carried from Kansas, the same one that had once held her marriage license and bruised prayers. She waited until after moonrise, then left by foot, wind whispering through the grass like it knew she wasn't welcome here anymore. When she arrived at the cabin, Bear Stride was sitting by the fire outside, whittling a strip of wood into the curve of a bird's wing. His eyes flicked up as she approached.
He said nothing. Just set the carving down and rose to his full height.
They're coming, she said.
He nodded once. They think you're dangerous. I am, he said plainly. But not to them. I'm sorry. You didn't bring this. But I didn't leave it behind either.
A silence fell between them, heavy with knowing.
Inside, they sat by the hearth.
She told him everything about the well whispers, the sheriff, the threat that wore smiles like knives. He listened. When she was done, he poured tea into a metal cup and handed it to her. "I'll leave," she said. "If it keeps you safe." "I'll go." He looked at her for a long time. The fire danced in his eyes like it recognized something ancient. No. That one word held the weight of every burial, every silence, every storm he'd weathered before. He stood and opened a cedar box by the far wall. Inside were items Eileen had never seen before: his father's feather sash, a rifle with markings down the barrel, a blade wrapped in otter hide. She touched his arm. "You don't have to fight them." "I'm not." "Then what are you doing?" "Standing." That night, as they slept, her in the cot near the fire, him near the door, the wind shifted. It smelled of smoke. He woke before she did. The barn was burning. Flames licked the sky like tongues, greedy and wild. The animals had scattered, the hound barking frantically. Bearstride shouted once, then grabbed a pail and ran toward the blaze. Eileen was beside him in seconds, her boots skidding in the dirt. Together, they fought it: water, shovels, smothered blankets. Ash clung to their skin, smoke in their lungs. Eileen's hands blistered. Bearstride's jacket caught once, and she smothered it with her bare arms. By dawn, the barn was black skeletons and smolder. Eileen sat on the steps, arms wrapped around her knees, hair soaked in sweat and soot. He knelt beside her, breathing hard. "I told you they'd come," she said. "I didn't know they'd bring fire." "They're afraid." "Not of you. Of what we are together." He looked at her, and for the first time, there was no guarded distance in his expression. Only clarity. "You don't belong in that town," he said. She nodded. "I don't belong anywhere but here." Later that morning, the sheriff arrived. 3 riders, dust in their wake. They came without urgency, but their eyes were loaded. Bearstride met them at the gate, Eileen behind him. Price dismounted. "Heard there was a fire." "Shame." Bearstride said nothing. Price looked over his shoulder at Eileen. "Miss Whitlow. There's been a wire from Kansas. Says your husband's kin are looking for you. Say you're married still. Say you stole from them." Eileen stepped forward. "I stole nothing but my freedom. And he's dead. He beat me until I broke. I left with less than nothing." Price raised an eyebrow. "You got no paper. No claim. No right to be here." "She does," Bearstride said. His voice was like distant thunder, low, steady, impossible to ignore. Price turned. "How's that?" "She's under my protection." "You planning to marry her?" "I'm planning to keep her safe." Price smirked. "That ain't legal." "I wasn't asking." The other men shifted in their saddles. Hands near their belts. Bearstride stepped closer. "You burned my barn. You come near my land again, I won't use words." Eileen stood beside him now. "You want to drag me back? Fine. Do it in front of the whole town. Let them see what men like you do to women who survive." For the first time, Price looked unsure. The silence around them held teeth. Then he turned his horse. "This ain't over." "No," Bearstride said. "It's just beginning." The riders left in a flurry of hoofbeats. Eileen let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her knees went weak. Bearstride caught her. She looked up at him, eyes burning. "They'll be back. Then we'll be ready." He helped her inside. Sat her down. Poured water. His hands trembled once, then steadied. She reached for him. Took his hand. "We didn't win," she whispered. "No," he said. "But we didn't lose either." Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, not in fury, but softly. Like a benediction. Inside, 2 souls sat shoulder to shoulder, marked by ash, bound not by vows but by survival, silence, and the fire they hadn't let consume them. And for the first time, Eileen understood what it meant to belong. Not to a place. To a person. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, first through the melting icicles that wept from the eaves of Bearstride's cabin, then through the softened ground where the snow once held dominion. Patches of green appeared like forgiveness, tentative and trembling, as if unsure they were welcome. But they came. And so did change. Eileen stood on the porch that morning, arms wrapped around herself, the scent of pine sap drifting on the breeze. Behind her, Bearstride hammered a new beam into place, rebuilding the barn that fire had taken. He worked without complaint, each strike of the mallet deliberate, echoing into the hills like a heartbeat. She watched him the way one watches a firelight in winter, knowing it could both warm and consume. There was something about his silence that had shifted in the months since that night. It was fuller now. Not empty. Not heavy. Just full. Like a river deep beneath the ice. The town hadn't returned. Not with flames, not with guns, not with legal claims. Perhaps the sheriff knew he had overstepped. Perhaps the people had grown tired of fear. Or perhaps Eileen thought quietly they had simply chosen another target. Someone else to throw stones at from behind their curtains. Either way, she did not miss them. Inside the cabin, the world had taken root. Eileen grew herbs in clay pots along the windowsill: basil, sage, peppermint. Bearstride carved a second chair for the fire, its arms shaped with gentle curves like open palms. They didn't speak often, but when they did, the words held weight. She told him about Kansas. About the baby that never came. About the time she ran so hard her soles bled through her shoes. He listened. Never interrupted. Just held her gaze with that stillness that asked for nothing and gave everything. He told her about the boy, his son, and how the fever had taken him before his 6th spring. How his wife's laughter had once filled these same walls. How he used to build whistles out of reeds just to make the child smile. Then one winter, the sound stopped. And he had stopped with it. But the sound returned, in time. She found him once, whittling again by the fire, carving a tiny horse with a feathered mane. He didn't say who it was for, but she knew. And he didn't stop her when she tucked it gently onto the mantel beside the framed sketches. They did not kiss. Not yet. Not in the way the world writes of. Their tenderness lived in smaller acts, bread cut in even slices, water fetched before the pitcher ran dry, shoulders touched in passing without flinching. Theirs was a love that warmed before it burned. And still, there were those who could not leave sleeping fires alone. It was dusk when the messenger came. A boy, no older than 12, on a skinny horse too small for the miles he'd traveled. He handed Eileen a letter and said nothing. Then rode off as quick as he'd arrived. She opened it with trembling fingers. Sheriff Price was dead. Shot by a drifter during a bar fight. The town was reeling. And there was talk again, talk of land rights, of Bearstride's cabin, of Apache blood and settler boundaries. There was a man riding in from Denver, claiming deeds and writs, armed with ink and arrogance. Eileen handed the letter to Bearstride, her eyes searching his. He read it once. Folded it. Set it down. We could leave, she said, her voice brittle. His answer came slow. This land remembers my son's name. Eileen turned her face to the wind. And now it remembers mine too. The next morning, they packed supplies and rode into town, not to surrender, but to be seen. Together. The ride was silent, not from fear, but preparation. When they arrived, people turned. Paused. Children stared. Women whispered. But no one stepped forward to stop them. Not even the new sheriff, a younger man with wary eyes who looked away as they passed. They rode all the way to the chapel. There, Eileen dismounted, her boots hitting the ground with a certainty she'd never known before. She entered with Bearstride beside her and sat in the front pew. When the preacher came forward, face pale with surprise, she stood. We're not here for blessing, she said. We're here so the town can witness something that doesn't require permission.
The preacher opened his mouth, closed it, nodded once. She turned to Bear Stride, took his hands in hers. I don't need papers. I don't need rings. I need only what's been given freely. He answered with the smallest smile, the kind that carried a decade of sorrow and one breath of hope. I give it, he said. Those 3 words hung in the chapel like candlelight. They left in silence. But they weren't followed. When they returned to the cabin, the wind picked up behind them. But this time, it felt different, not cold, not biting. Just strong. Like it knew who they were now. The next day, Bear Stride planted a cedar where the barn had burned. Eileen stood beside him, a hand resting on the wooden comb he'd carved her months ago. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Life resumed, not as it was, but as it could be. She taught local children how to read when the mothers dared send them. He began trading again woodwork, furs, herbs. Slowly, the town leaned closer. Not with trust, but with recognition. And recognition, they found, was a beginning. Eileen often watched the hills at sunset, the sky drenched in honey and flame. The fire still lived. In the hearth. In their breath. In the space between their fingers. Sometimes she'd turn to Bear Stride and say, it should have ended with the fire. And he'd reply, it began there. One evening, she found a letter tucked into the folds of her satchel, old, yellowed, creased from too many nights untouched. It was the letter she'd carried from Kansas. From her mother, sent long before the last beating, the last escape. She sat on the porch and read it finally. It was short. Apologetic. Too late. She folded it slowly, placed it in the fire. It burned soft, no rage left in the ash. Later that night, she stood before Bear Stride and said, you were right. The snow ends. But the fire, it stays. He touched her cheek. Just once. And she leaned into him like a promise. In the years that followed, the town forgot the exact reasons they'd once feared her. Feared him. Children whispered stories of the cabin in the woods, of the tall Apache and the woman who'd arrived with nothing but frost on her sleeves. But the land remembered. It remembered the fire that came from men, and the fire that rose from love. It remembered her name. And in the hush between seasons, the trees whispered it back. Sometimes, all it takes is one act of quiet defiance, one coat given in a snowstorm, one silence shared beneath a roof, to start the kind of blaze that warms a lifetime. Because snow melts. But love, when fed gently, can burn forever.